Most of my career has actually been in Latin America, though, and so I've done assignments in Dominican Republic, Peru, served twice in Mexico, and did a stint in South Asia and in Sri Lanka as well, and then worked here on European issues, on African issues, and have done now 3 different detail assignments. So, Sean, you've done 2, I've done 3. You got to catch up with me,
Yeah.
man.
What's the third?
So I did a Cox Fellowship where I went
Oh,
and
okay.
directed a
Oh,
movie. I
that's
taught
great.
for another term over at the Inter-American Defense College, which is over in Fort McNair in Southwest DC, and then teaching here my fantastically brilliant students.
If you didn't hear what Chris said, they paid him to direct a movie.
They did. That's right.
All right, so that's pretty good.
So you can see there's a lot of variety of stuff you'll do, right, as a diplomat. My history is probably a little more unusual than most. Most people don't do as many kind of detail assignments. You might do 1 or 2 in the course of your career. I've done quite a few. It's not unusual, however, to serve in multiple regions. In fact, they encourage you to serve in multiple regions. That's part of the deal, right? You are considered worldwide available, and so you come in, and even though you might be a fluent German speaker, guess what? You're going to go do visa work in the Philippines. And so
You might love it.
right, yeah. I mean, but it's going to be not necessarily what you're expecting, kind of coming in. I think that's one thing, particularly for the generalist side of those that are starting the Foreign Service. You have an expectation. I'm a German speaker. I really understand the political, economic situation in Germany. I'm going to be this bright senior advisor to the ambassador there, and that's not going to happen. Not for a lot of years, at any rate. So I kind of, sort of with that, I do want to get and talk about different categories of things to think about when we talk about the State Department. I do want to have one other kind of mention. State Department is, I guess, the largest foreign affairs agency, but there are other foreign affairs agencies. USAID, which does development work. Department of Commerce has Foreign Commercial Service, which is commerce, trade, promoting American businesses. Foreign Agricultural Service, and as you can imagine, you're doing a lot of the ag work, also trade issues and whatnot. And who am I missing?
Used to be the Board of Broadcast Governors.
Well, they're still out there. Yeah, they still do the VOA transmissions.
So
and all
VOA, Voice of America,
Yeah.
Radio Free Asia, right? Those organizations.
Yeah, and so we do have Foreign Service within that that are serving overseas as well.
And of course, there are a lot of agencies in the U.S. government that have significant presence overseas, right? Obviously, DOD, lots of civilian agencies, law enforcement agencies. So the Foreign Service is one way to serve. Chris and I probably think it's the best way to serve because of the variety of places you can go and things you can do, but it's by no means the only way to serve. And if you look at yourself and you are honest with yourself, and the Foreign Service, it's foreign and it's service, right? So you should expect to spend the majority of your careers overseas. If that doesn't appeal to you and you would prefer to spend the majority of your career here in the U.S. with occasional stints overseas, there are options both within the Department of State and other agencies to do that. But the Foreign Service would be for people who really are interested in spending most of your professional career overseas, serving your country as opposed to in this giant puzzle palace building nearby here in Washington.
Yeah, that's very true, and I think it's useful as you're beginning to think about career options and what you want to do. That's one of the reasons I'm a big advocate of people taking internships or some of these fellowship programs, so you can kind of test the waters. And as part of that, even testing the water overseas, they have internships where you can be at an embassy during the summer, for example. And get a sense as to really what it's like working overseas at an embassy. It's not all cocktail parties and sipping lemonade by the pool. It's a lot of cables, late night hours, writing cables, doing outreach events, dealing with sometimes uncomfortable, hostile audiences, sometimes foreign governments who aren't too happy with us. So it can be challenging, and the other thing, as Sean had mentioned, you are spending a lot of your time overseas if you do have a career of this, and so you have to think, is this something I want to do with my life? To move every 2 or 3 years,
Right.
sometimes from one end of the globe to the other. radically different cultures, different languages. It's not really for everybody. And some people, again, if you go in with the idea, oh, I'm going to be the senior advisor to the ambassador, don't you understand how brilliant my German is and how much I have to offer? Yes, thank you. But you're probably not going to be playing that role for quite a while in your career.
So Chris and I, we've talked about this before, and we have kind of an opposite approach than you might see at most recruiting things. We like to tell people all the reasons why you may not want to do this job that we have, because then you might know why you may want to do this job. And we do that,
Right.
We're not dour, pessimistic people by nature. But we do that because it's a very unique job. The Foreign Service I'm talking about in particular, right? So you'll see up here there are several different options within the State Department, right? But the Foreign Service officer, Foreign Service specialist route, that is where you are expected to spend the majority of your career overseas. You will be changing assignments every 2 to 3 years on average, right? And not just countries. You will be changing assignments. You'll be changing duties, portfolios. You may be an economic officer in Dhaka, where I started out, and then be a consular officer in Pakistan, and then be a political officer in Bangkok, and then So you may be changing not only countries and languages, but also portfolios and duties. So if that is something that sounds exciting to you, and you have a short attention span like me, it's a great career. If you are somebody who would really rather dig in and become a subject matter expert on one thing and work on that one thing year after year for 20 years until you are the absolute best at that, the Foreign Service may not be the right career for you, right? You become very good at getting stuff done, at adapting to new cultures, at helping to explain what's going on the ground here to people back in Washington. You become the best at that, but you rarely will become the preeminent expert on post-Soviet politics in the Caucasus, right? I mean, that's not something you're probably going to get the chance to do as a Foreign Service officer, because you will have been to 5, 6, 7, 8 countries, all with their own unique politics, right? So you'll get very good at landing on the ground and figuring stuff out real quick, figuring out how to get stuff done, but not the expert thing. If the expert thing appeals to you, the civil service has numerous jobs where you're in offices focusing on one issue, one region, one specific issue set, right? Sometimes with the same people for many, many years, and certainly other agencies do as well. So the Foreign Service, I think, requires a kind of a thirst for change, a thirst for the unexpected, for ambiguity. You have to be comfortable and almost excited by ambiguity at times. Right, and that's where Chris and I are coming from.
Yeah, I think that's true. The other kind of caveat I would say is the timelines. This is not a quick, easy process. Even some of the internships things that I'm going to talk about, the cycle for this coming summer is pretty much already over, right? So thinking about if you're going to be applying for programs that the department has, you're basically looking at applying for things, essentially a year out. The same is true with Foreign Service exams. You're usually applying, going through the multi-step process. It could take a year, 2 years, maybe even more to be hired and brought on. The advantage we have right now is we're doing this hiring surge, and so we're bringing on a lot more people. I think in our last orientation class, which was combined generalist and specialist, was 240 or something like that. It was just an astronomical number, which for our orientation is quite large. For example, my group, we had 43 of us starting.
Right, and then we had 98, and that was the largest class they'd had in 20 years. So, I mean, 200 something is pretty big.
It's incredible to think about that number,
class.
all coming through at the same time. But that's an indication of, hey, Congress is willing to fund diplomacy right now. The administration's taking advantage of it. The secretary has made it a priority to get everybody on board as quickly as we can. And so that process is a little more sped up maybe than in the past. Nonetheless, all the hurdles you have to go through, you need to really plan this. So when I graduated from GW, it was probably 2 years later that I actually was hired and began at the department. So that's another thing to keep in mind. You've got to pay attention to deadlines, timelines, and see what works with your life. When are you graduating? What are you thinking 2, 3, 4, 5 years out? And how you might want to try to time that to the extent you can ever time anything with the State Department.
So, I mean, for those of you who process things, through algorithms, right, there are a few choices you need to make on the tree, right? First is whether or not this kind of thing interests you at all. If it does, the next decision to make is, I mean, assuming you're looking at the State Department, is what kind of employee do you want to be in the State Department? What path to entry do you want to take? The Foreign Service generalist path, the specialist path, the civil service path, right? There's a fellows program or the internships, right? So that's kind of the next thing to think about. And then in terms of a career, you then want to think about substantively, what do I want to be doing, right? So Chris and I came on as generalists. That means, kind of general diplomats as opposed to specialists in the Foreign Service who focus on a specific skill set like IT or security, or we have a medical corps, right? So when we say generalists, that means diplomat. That means, colloquially what you would think of as a diplomat, somebody who goes out and does public affairs, economic, political, even management, right? Consular work, those 5 specialties. Specialists are people with specific skill sets like IT, like healthcare, security, right? And they just do that one thing over and over again. Chris and I came on as generalists. We've done a lot of different things in our careers, right? But, you may look at that path and say, well, yeah, I'd rather sort of focus on one thing, right? And I'd rather do it here. Okay, well, then that's going to lean you towards the civil service track, right? I want to go overseas, but I want to, focus on, I'm kind of more of a management person. I want to be a management specialist. You can do that. You can be a GSO specialist, right? And then as Chris said, the timeline is long. So I think regardless of what path you choose to focus on to go for, I mean, if you're assuming that you want to go for one of these, regardless of what path you want to go for, I would not alter your life one iota while you're waiting for that to happen, right? Go through the process, take the exams, do the interviews, apply on USA Jobs if you're doing the civil service, whatever path you're taking, right? We can help you know what you got to do, but don't quit your job. Don't break up with your boyfriend, girlfriend, significant other. Don't purchase a house or sell a house. Don't make any major decisions, right, while you're waiting for this to happen, because as Chris said, it can take a long time, and there are a lot of things that are out of your control, right? I mean, part of it is how well you do on the exams or the interview process and all that. Part of it is like, did Congress fund us up for 200 officers or 100 this year, right? We don't know. We don't know what Congress is going to do next year. And so what that means, there's a freedom in that, right? Which means, to me, if you have even a 1% thing in your head that you might want to do this, just do it. Just take the test, send your resume in, do whatever you got to do for one of these paths. If you think there's even a 1% chance you might want to take it, just do it, right? And then when you get accepted, right, when you get the call, you will be in a position to say yes or no. If you're waiting for the moment when you are 100% sure and everything in your life is lined up perfectly and all your ducks in a row, well, that's the starting point, and it's going to be another 2 years after that, right? And you don't know where your life is going to be in those 2 years. So in my case, I was a lawyer in Tokyo. I started in New York, and I got a little bored in New York, so I went to Tokyo with a U.S. firm, and I was practicing out there. And, I was a single guy. I was making money. I was living in Tokyo, paying off all my loans. I met a woman who's now my wife. We were dating. I was happy. I took the test, and I failed. Failed it, right? So I was like, okay, well, I can't fail it. I have to go back and take this thing again, see if I can pass it, right? So I go back, and I take it, and I pass it the second time. And I always knew I wanted to go into public service, but I thought, I'm making money, I'm doing good in Tokyo, it'll be someday. I just want to see if I can pass this thing. Passed it. They gave me an offer for the class that would have started September 10th, 2001. So there was a class that started the day before 9/11, right? And I turned them down. I said, nope, thanks, I know I can pass. I checked defer, because I'm not dumb, right? I checked defer, not no. And then 9/11 happened. And everything in my mind changed, which is someday, serving my country someday became right now, because I felt very passionate about it. I'm from New York. It hit home. I had friends who died in the towers. And so I called them back and I said, hey, sorry I deferred, but can I, and they said, good, you're in luck. Colin Powell's the secretary. They are hiring like crazy, and we can slot you in for the January class. But had I not taken that test just on a whim on the 1%, even just to see if I could pass it, I would not have been in that position to take that offer. And conversely, I could have taken it knowing 100% I want to do it, and then my wife says, I'm not interested in that, or the woman I'm going to marry says, I'm not interested, and then you don't do it. You go off and you do something else.
Well, and your kind of point about, deferring and not, once you go through the process, and this is true for both specialists as well as generalists, so you've got a written exam, you've got a series of essays, you have to show your skills and knowledge, and then you have an oral exam. Once you go through all that, and then they say, okay, we're willing to make an offer, they still have to complete medical, they still have to complete background checks so you can get a security clearance, et cetera. But then they can begin to slot you into what will be one of the upcoming orientation classes. And you can say, oh, I'd like to defer. And you can stay on a list for up to 18 months. And so that's where you can kind of try to sort, well, I need to sell a house, well, I need to move, I need to do all these other things. It's not as though they say, well, we need you here on Monday, and today is Wednesday. You can have some opportunities to have that flexibility to think what you need to do to get sort of your affairs in order, and then to make the change, because it is a commitment. And so you'll come to Washington, you'll do your initial training, and then pretty quickly, and we can talk about the various categories, but pretty quickly after you are go through orientation, and this is true for both generalists and for specialists, you are assigned a course. You might get 50 different countries, and you have to rank order them 1 through 50. But people will assign you and direct you to where you're going to go. And so you can say, hey, I'm that German speaker. I'm really ready to do U.S.-German policy. And they say, great, you're going to go do visa work in the Philippines for the next 2 years.
For your first 2 tours. Right.
Sometimes you have to do consular work for your first 2 tours.
Well, I mean, the assignment, I'm saying.
The directed assignment,
is
yeah,
the first
that's right.
2 tours. Right.
So you'll have directed assignment after that, after you get tenured, and that comes after the 2 tours. Then there's a normal bidding process where bid lists come out, jobs are available around the world, and you put in, again, sort of a rank ordered list that you're interested in. But it's maybe 5 or 6 that you're trying to negotiate and talk about. And we can get more into details about what that's like, but I did want to take a quick sort of check about the various categories. So generalist, as Sean said, we're both generalists. We have these 5 categories. Pretty self-explanatory. Political officers cover.
Well, actually, just quickly before we start on that, just you can roughly break down State Department employees into 2 broad categories, right? There's the Foreign Service and there's the Civil Service. The kind of the equivalent, if you think of DOD, right? You have uniformed military and you have civilians, right? So the Foreign Service would be more equivalent to the uniformed military, not in the sense that we wear uniforms and we train, but it's more mobile. It's rank and person. The personnel system is kind of like that, and then so it's separate personnel systems. So one is DC based. Civil Service is primarily based in Washington. You do one job your whole career. Foreign Service is primarily based overseas. You do many different assignments in your career, and then we break them down further.
Yeah, and so you got these categories. So the 5 categories: political reporting. You're covering political events within a country. You might be covering, a whole range of issues, but essentially that relate to bilateral, multilateral, regional political issues. Then you've got economic, which, as you could imagine, deal with sort of the macroeconomic issues, but also dealing with a lot of the American companies, the American Chamber of Commerce that might be there. Where we don't have Foreign Commercial Service, you might be the Foreign Commercial Service representative as well, kind of dealing on those issues. The management cone is the other, and so that really deals with the whole platform of managing issues, which is the infrastructure itself, the buildings, housing, personnel, all the HR kind of stuff, the budget and finance sort of issues. Sometimes if it's a smaller post, you don't even have a security officer, and so you might also be doing security as part of that. So kind of the whole range of general services that we would say. Consular, which is American Citizen Services, which is the primary issue for any embassy overseas, Americans in that country. And so that American Citizen Services work is really extraordinarily important. And then there's the visa side of it, whether it's immigrant visas or non-immigrant visas. And then you've got public diplomacy, and that involves media relations, it involves culture, exchange, education, and kind of everything else, other duties as assigned, kind of get thrown into that as well. So those are the general categories. And so you've done political work, you've done econ work, you've done consular work. I've done management work, I've done public diplomacy work, I've done consular work. So If you're a generalist, you can move among some of those categories. Not so much true with specialists. So if you're hired as an IT specialist, you're hired with a degree, and there's an expectation for degree and sort of experience. And you're not going to be an IT specialist and then go off and be a consular officer, not generally. You can, but very rarely. Medical, we're hiring people with either nurse practitioners or MDs or physician's assistants, very specific degrees and experience they need to do those specific jobs. Construction engineers, they're not going to hire me to go build a new embassy, right?
You don't want to work in that embassy.
You don't want to work in that embassy. But we do need people with those very specific skills. Again, needs an engineering degree and needs some experience and background. So those specialists are hired because of the degrees they have and the experience they have, and they will go do only those kinds of jobs overseas, as opposed to us among the generalist pool, which may mix and do a variety of things, not just in countries, but also among kind of those various skills.
Right.
Let's talk a little bit. There's another category that's called consular fellows. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but we are hiring for these individuals. They aren't full-time permanent employment positions in that you have a limited 5-year appointment. And so if you speak one of these languages, we have big visa demand in the countries that speak these languages. And so you could be hired to do up to 2 assignments, to do consular work, to do visa adjudication in Brazil, in anywhere in Mission China, most anywhere else in Latin America where there's a big visa demand. And so, again, that's based on your already existing language skills.
Right.
That you have to have, and you've got to use those skills in at least one of those 2 assignments. You may not in both, but you definitely would in one. So that's a separate process, and you can find some of this information. All of this you can find in careers.state.gov. So I always urge people to go back and keep looking at that website, careers.state.gov.
You can also scan this at the end.
We have the QR code here. And then, real quickly, let's go over some of the student programs, the various internships and whatnot. And then why don't we just open it up to some questions for you guys. I do have a few files that I want to just kind of quickly go over with.
But I guess we should let me just mention the civil service as well, because we had talked about that. But, so what Chris was describing were the foreign service options, generalist, specialist. Here in Washington and in other places in the U.S., we have many, many civil servants, right? And what civil servants do is everything, right? So anything you imagine the State Department doing, any office the State Department has, there are civil servants working in that office. And again, the main difference is that a civil servant is hired to do a specific job in a specific place indefinitely, right? So it's much more like other government jobs where you were hired to be a specialist, a labor relations specialist for the Department of Labor in Cincinnati. That's your job, right? State Department will have people who are, Egypt country officers working on the Egypt desk on Egypt bilateral issues here in Washington, or narcotics program officers covering the Middle East here in Washington. And you do not need to transfer every 2 or 3 years. You are in that job indefinitely as long as you perform well, or until you choose to apply for another job in the civil service or elsewhere. So that's the main difference, right? So again, if you have a particular passion and you want to stay in Washington in an interest, I would encourage you to look at the civil service. And you can look at those jobs on usajobs.gov.
They're all through USA.
Just like you would look for any other civil service job with any other agency. Right. Foreign service, very different.
Different process. All right, so let's go over a few of the university programs, and you can kind of see here. This was a slide we'd put together last year, and you can see last year's dates for a lot of these things have already passed. But this will give you an idea to think about. Okay, we're in 2023. There will be similar kind of things to be coming up. So looking at deadlines that are going to be coming up in the summer or even the fall for a lot of the different types of programs that you'd be interested in. There's a few that I want to talk to. We have anybody in grad school, or we have all undergrads here? We've got so with some grad students, there are several types of programs depending on what you might be interested in doing. There are a couple Do I have, yeah, so Wrangell is one that could be done both for undergrad as well as grad, as well as Pickering can be done for both undergrad as well as grad. Some of the internships, which include, we've got here listed some of the things for the undergrad internships, but there are some internship programs for graduate students as well. And fortunately now, almost all of our internships, if not all of them, are now paid internships.
Yeah, I think so.
So it used to be you had unpaid interns and you would go overseas and work at an embassy and you didn't get a salary. Sometimes you had to scramble and get housing. Sometimes the embassy
Weird,
had
yeah.
housing, sometimes they didn't. It was a terrible program. It was a good program because you got to have the experience. It was terrible how it was not funded. So we were able to get that funded. Congress finally gave us funding, I guess, 2 years ago now,
Yeah.
to have that. So now all those internship programs are paid for. So if you were to go overseas for a summer internship and work in an embassy, you'd at least get a salary if you had a position here. So I think that has been very helpful. The other thing that's interesting is the virtual student internship as well. I've used those. I don't know if you've used any of those overseas, but I've used some of those. And you can be based domestically here, but we had an intern that worked with us in our kind of combined Paul Econ office. And so there was a student that worked, I don't know, X number of hours a week, and we would ask them to do research on some economic issues related to, I think, U.S.-Mexico trade, for example. And so that was something that you could do any part of the world, but, we were putting together cables, we were writing speeches, we were, wanting to get information together. And so the virtual student program, one, is good because you can be anywhere. And it also gives you a sense as to kind of some of the work and requirement and not really have to leave here Washington and have some flexibility with your time as well, as opposed to if you're in a regular normal internship, you're either at post living there 24/7 or you're going over to the State Department, X number of hours a week or during the semester. So that's another thing to highlight just to give you a little bit of an idea about. I don't think we have the Powell. There's another one. There's a Colin Powell fellowship as well. And several of these scholarships and fellowships, the Pathways program is one. While you're in grad school, you can actually be hired as a civil service. You're hired into a civil service position. I think it's a GS7 or something
Yeah.
like that. It's not a great salary, but you're in grad school. You can sort of have some flexibility with work and grad school, and it's sort of an entryway program into later joining the Foreign Service. If you're doing civil service work, for example, and get hired into a civil service, you can't automatically transfer into the Foreign Service. You still have to go through the exams and those processes, but it sure gives you a lot better understanding and information about what foreign policy work is like. And so there's a lot of people who do internships or have done civil service work that then will subsequently take the Foreign Service exam and are much more successful because they know a lot more about what our process and systems are like.
Right. Also give you a chance. I mean, if you do an internship overseas, it gives you a chance to see what it's like
Yeah.
a little bit. And I've run into former interns that are now in the Foreign Service and very happy and made that decision. I've run into former interns that chose not to join the Foreign Service.
Right.
Not because they didn't like it. They just said, you know what, it's not for me. Like moving around every couple of years, it's not for me.
Yeah,
And,
no, that's exactly
Yeah.
right. Here's just a few more again to look at. I'd mentioned Pickering and Wrangell. That actually funds your education,
Yeah.
and so that's why there's a big interest in it. It's a highly competitive program. It does require a repayment of commitment of 5 years minimum. But then at that point, if you decide, hey, you want to stay in and go through Foreign Service, you are, you're able to stay into the Foreign Service.
Think of that as kind of the ROTC of the Foreign Service.
That's about right. We've got a few other programs for diplomatic security. There's this Clark Fellowship for our information management folks. We have this new FATE program, and so if you know people who are interested in law enforcement issues, security issues, let people know about diplomatic security, let people know from the IT field. With really all of these categories, and this is where I think Sean's mantra about it's foreign service, it's service, you're not making as much money in the private sector. I think we can be honest about that. We don't have to try to pretend, oh, there's all these other benefits. Yeah, okay, you're overseas and you get housing. Yeah, there's, retirement benefits. Yes, there's a lot of advantages. But if you're a lawyer, you're making a lot more money. If you're an IT worker, you're making a lot more money at Google.
Absolutely,
you're not doing this for the glamorous lifestyle. You're doing this because you really care about U.S. foreign policy. You really care about have an interest in other countries and cultures. Really want to try to make a difference. And so it's not as though you can't earn a decent salary. You can certainly do that.
Look, you do find you're not going to be,
Right.
You're not eating bread and rice every night, but yeah, no, it is service. It's public service, and most people who join the Foreign Service, I mean, I've been very impressed with the skill set and the quality and the commitment of my colleagues, and those skills and that commitment could translate into more money in the private sector, almost for sure, for almost everyone that we've served with, right? So the point is, if you're going to get in and you are talented enough and committed enough to get in and hardworking enough to do the job, you could apply those talents in the private sector and probably make more, right?
That's true.
But there's an esprit de corps, and there's kind of a sense of accomplishment, I think, that comes along with it. And you'll know if that matters to you, right? That's just something that you will know for yourself if that idiosyncratic value is worth it. And for Chris and I, it is.
Yeah, and it's you can be overseas working. You were a good example of doing that in Tokyo. If you're working at Embassy Tokyo, your work is going to be radically different, and you're going to be doing things that you would never do in the private sector, right? I mean, vice versa. You could be doing things in the private sector. You may not be working in government service, but you'll have access to types of individuals. You'll be working on issues. You'll have an impact in just a very, very different way. And so, again, that's part of a different way to think and a different way to sort of plan your career and what you want to do. But that's just another consideration that's out there. Anyway, all of this information, in short, you can find on careers.state.gov. When you go to internships and fellowships, you can find about this. And I think the other new one is the Powell Fellowship, which I don't. Oh, we do have the Powell thing. We did put it up there. So that's the newest, I think, of the programs. I sat on a panel last year that looked through applications for students who were putting in for internships, and so they would be starting these internships this summer. There's a process of putting in an essay. Obviously, you need to meet minimum with GPA, et cetera. But one of the things that struck me when reading through all these essays, and there were dozens of essays in the cohort that we had to read, evaluate, and then kind of rank order, were just those issues about thinking about why are you doing this? You could be doing 1,000 other things. You're all very bright, capable people. What is it you have to contribute? Why is it important for you to do this? And what sort of difference do you want to make? Just simply because you speak fluent German doesn't mean you're going to be a great intern necessarily. Just because you have a familiarity with a country or a culture or a language, great, but what's the missing quality there? Why do we need to have you as opposed to somebody else contribute? And so think about that as you're looking at applications, particularly the internship applications, because I read a lot of bright students from universities all around the country. And it became very clear quickly there were two categories. There were the categories of, oh, yes, I'm an overachiever and I'm bright and you should select me simply because of that. And that wasn't enough. That really wasn't enough. So think about your motivation and think how you want to make that pitch to people and convince others that why you'd be the best candidate for that job.